Picture this. A supertanker the length of 4 football fields, loaded with 2 million barrels of crude, sits dead in the water. Not because it broke down. Not because there is nowhere to dock. It cannot move because 21 miles of the most strategically vital ocean on Earth have become, for all practical purposes, a war zone. That 21-mile gap between Iran and Oman is the Strait of Hormuz. 1 in 5 barrels of oil consumed anywhere on Earth moves through it. Or it did. And right now, the global economy is paying a price that most people have not even begun to calculate. What happens when you remove 20% of the global oil supply from the market? Not gradually. Not with warning. Almost overnight. The answer is playing out right now. Brent crude surging toward $120 a barrel, U.S. inflation reversing course after 18 months of progress, emerging market currencies in freefall, and a president deploying war powers that have not been this constitutionally contested since Vietnam. This is the story of how a regional conflict in the Persian Gulf became everyone's economic emergency, and why even the fragile ceasefire now in place may not be enough to stop the damage already set in motion. To understand how we got here, you have to rewind. The US-Iran confrontation did not start with a single dramatic moment. It built through proxy strikes in Iraq and Syria, through increasingly aggressive Iranian naval maneuvers in the Gulf, through an Iranian nuclear program that crossed thresholds Washington had publicly promised would trigger a military response. By late 2025, the math had changed irreversibly. The US struck. Iran retaliated. And then Iran made the move that upended the global economic order. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Not with a traditional naval blockade, but with a combination of sea mines, anti-ship missile batteries positioned along its coastline, and explicit warnings that any tanker attempting transit risked destruction. The world's most critical shipping lane went dark in a matter of days. Here is the number that should stop you cold. 20%. That is the share of globally traded oil and roughly a third of all seaborne petroleum that moved through the Strait of Hormuz before the conflict. The nations whose exports depend on that passage, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Bahrain. Combined, they export more oil than Russia and the United States put together. And suddenly, they had nowhere to send it at scale. Could the oil flow another way? Technically, some of it. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline, the Petroline, can carry around 5 million barrels per day to Red Sea ports. The UAE has its pipeline to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, adding another 1.5 million. But the Strait was handling close to 20 million barrels a day. No pipeline network on Earth closes that gap. The math simply does not work, and the global market has been adjusting to that brutal arithmetic ever since. Let's make this personal. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not an abstraction. It is in your grocery bill. It is in the price you paid to fill your tank last week. When oil prices surge toward $120 a barrel, the transmission into consumer prices is almost immediate, and it does not stop at fuel. U.S. headline inflation, which had been grinding toward the Federal Reserve's 2% target through late 2025, has reversed sharply. The most recent reading sits at 3.8% and climbing. Roughly 1 full percentage point of that reading traces directly to the energy cost pass-through from this disruption. Every physical good that moves on a truck, a ship, or a plane became more expensive. Fertilizer, which depends heavily on natural gas, spiked, pushing food prices up a supply chain far removed from any oil field. Plastics, chemicals, aviation fuel, construction materials, all upstream of crude. The shock did not just hit energy. It hit everything energy touches. And in a modern economy, that means everything. Not everyone is suffering. For certain players, this is an extraordinary windfall. Russia, already selling discounted oil through Arctic shipping routes and a shadow tanker fleet that Western sanctions never fully eliminated, is benefiting from prices 60% above where they sat 18 months ago. Moscow does not need the Strait to be open. Every week it stays closed is another week of fiscal breathing room for the Kremlin. Then there is the perverse situation facing the Gulf states themselves. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, they hold exactly what the world desperately needs, but cannot get it out at full volume. And on the other end of the ledger, a group of emerging market economies are staring at something that looks less like inflation and more like existential crisis. Pakistan, Egypt, Kenya, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Nations that import the majority of their energy, carry substantial dollar-denominated debt, and are watching capital flee to safety as their currencies erode. For these countries, this is not a supply shock. This is a sovereign debt spiral in slow motion. In Washington, the conflict has triggered a constitutional collision that has not been seen in a generation. President Trump authorized the initial strikes against Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure under Article 2 executive war powers, without a formal congressional authorization for use of military force. What is unprecedented is the scale, the duration, and the explicit economic warfare dimension of what has followed. A coalition of lawmakers from both parties has invoked the War Powers Resolution, demanding a congressional vote to authorize or end the conflict. The White House maintains the strikes were defensive and that ongoing naval operations fall within the commander-in-chief's inherent authority. The courts have not resolved it. Congress has not forced a vote. The conflict continues with no formal legal architecture beyond executive orders, a constitutional gray zone as consequential as any in modern American history. The financial markets have been processing this shock in real time, and the feedback loops are brutal. When oil spikes, inflation expectations rise. When inflation expectations rise, bond markets sell off. When bonds sell off, yields climb. When yields climb, the cost of carrying debt rises across the entire economy. The Federal Reserve, which was cutting rates through late 2025, is now caught in a trap. Raise rates to fight the new inflation, and you risk tipping a slowing economy into outright recession. Hold rates and let energy-driven inflation become entrenched, and you lose credibility that took years to rebuild. Markets are now pricing near zero probability of rate cuts anywhere in 2026. That expectation shift is itself contractionary, tightening financial conditions without the Fed pulling a single lever. In the technology sector, particularly semiconductor manufacturers dependent on complex global supply chains and energy-intensive fabrication, the freight and energy cost squeeze is only beginning to show up in earnings. The pressure is building beneath the surface. 33 days ago, a ceasefire took hold. April 8th. The guns are quieter. But here is what a ceasefire does and does not accomplish. It stops the shooting. It does not immediately reopen a strait that was mined, that both sides' navies remain positioned around, and that global shipping insurers have effectively blacklisted. War risk premiums on Persian Gulf transits spiked over 400% during the conflict. They have barely moved since the ceasefire. Tanker captains are not going back until mines are physically cleared, missile batteries are verifiably stood down, and a formal security framework exists. None of that is in place. For a full Hormuz reopening, 3 conditions need to be met: a verified Iranian military withdrawal from anti-ship positions, international minesweeping operations, which under ideal conditions take months, and a diplomatic framework credible enough for insurers to write policies again. None of the 3 are close. The economic damage continues to compound quietly, systematically, even with the ceasefire technically holding. So what are the signals to watch? First, minesweeping operations. If an international naval coalition begins systematic strait clearance, that is the single most bullish indicator for oil prices. Second, Federal Reserve language at its next meeting. Any signal of inflation tolerance over hiking is what markets are waiting for. Third, OPEC Plus emergency production decisions, whether Saudi Arabia and the UAE can redirect enough pipeline volume to meaningfully ease prices. And fourth, the most unpredictable, the fragility of the ceasefire itself. A single drone strike, a naval miscalculation, one escalatory incident resets the clock entirely. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide. The shockwave it has released has no geographic boundary. What began as a military confrontation in the Persian Gulf is now a financial crisis for emerging markets, an inflation reversal for Western consumers, a constitutional crisis in Washington, and a strategic windfall for Moscow. This is what a 21st century supply shock looks like, not just an energy problem, but a cascading failure across every system that energy touches. If you want to understand how these systems connect, how a shipping lane in the Persian Gulf ends up in your grocery bill, subscribe. Because the next chapter of this story is still being written.